Good morning, I'm Chris Glenn. I'm the project director of SDMNY, Supported Decision Making New York. And today I'm going to be talking to you about supported decision making, which of course you know something about or you wouldn't be here, where it comes from, why it's important, and also what you're going to be doing in the training today and the next training on the next day. A couple of notes in advance. One is that I use PowerPoint slides. I promise you that I don't read from them, but I think it's useful for you to have the information, and this way, because it's in your binder, you don't have to take extensive notes. And second, it may seem like there's more here than you need to know, but I think it's important to ground this work that we're doing in the human rights conversation, and I'll talk to you more a little bit later about why that's true. And also it's stuff that may come up when you're dealing either with your decision maker or with supporters or even with other people. So bear with me. I hope this will be interesting to you. First, who are we? So Supported Decision Making New York is a collaboration between Hunter College and the City University of New York, which is where I'm from, the New York Alliance for Innovation and Inclusion, and the Arc of Westchester. The Alliance is a statewide association of provider agencies. The Arc of Westchester is a very big provider. And then as our fourth partner, we have Disability Rights New York, which is the federally funded protection and advocacy agency for New York State. And it provides legal services for people with intellectual and other kinds of disabilities. And as you will hear, they will be providing the legal support for people in restoration proceedings here. So that's who we are. You should also know, this is another thing about me, is that for 7 years I was the surrogate in Manhattan, which meant that I did the hearings by which people with intellectual disability were put under guardianship. It's how I got into this work. It's why I care so passionately about it. But it's also about guardianship. And Supported Decision Making New York was funded by the New York State Developmental Disabilities Council, not only to do education about supported decision making, but also to do 2 pilot programs that would demonstrate that supported decision making is an excellent and viable alternative to guardianship. So because I was the surrogate and because we're looking for an alternative to guardianship, let's start with guardianship. So guardianship is the legal process by which the state, which is to say the court, which was to say me when I was the surrogate, took away from a person with intellectual or developmental disabilities, the right to make all decisions and gave that power to another person who is called the guardian. This is a pretty serious situation. And the question you might ask is, why would people seek guardianship for their children or for other loved ones who have intellectual disabilities when it is such a profound deprivation of legal and civil rights? So there are really 2 main reasons. There are probably a million sub-reasons, but one is that particularly parents of transition age youth are often told by the schools, by transition coordinators, or by service providers that when their child turns 18 and they lose the legal authority that they would have over any child under 18, that they should get guardianship. I just want to tell you right away, it's not necessary. It's not necessary for IEPs. A lot of what parents are told is just not true, so you should know that. But the second reason, and I think it's the one that's really important to think about, is that parents are told and believe that guardianship somehow will protect their children. And that's a hard thing to get around because they believe it and they want to believe it, and it's been told to them so many times. So I've found it very useful to think a little bit about the protection, in quotes, of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in a historical framework. So up until around the 1870s or 1880s, when we were primarily a rural agrarian society, people lived in small towns, everybody knew each other, and people with intellectual disabilities just were part of the community. They might do some simpler work. They might be working with the animals in the field as opposed to the store in town, but they were just part of the community, and everybody knew who they were and understood what their limitations might be and accommodated them. And then as we became so there was no need for protection. And then as we became a more urbanized society, the need for literacy grew more important. And suddenly people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were seen as different in a way that wasn't necessarily so good. So initially there was a kind of push for education, and the thought was that that education would be better and more effective if it were segregated, if people with IDD, and I'm going to say IDD a lot, so forgive me for that. People with IDD were together in one place and they were educated, and then presumably they could return to the community and be included in the community. And while that was a great idea and it worked for a while, pretty soon those schools, and they were called schools often until the very end, turned into institutions. And parents were told, this is what you need to do for your child. Your child needs to be educated this way, and your child needs to be in a segregated place because that way he or she will be safe. And that went on really until the 60s, when we began to have these extraordinary exposés of the horrors that were going on in some of these institutions. And in New York State, the most famous one was a place called Willowbrook on Long Island. And probably many of you were born after this happened or were too little to know about it, but you can still Google the tapes when an intrepid reporter snuck in and took horrible, horrible videos of people in just unspeakable conditions. So all of a sudden, these parents who had thought they were doing the right thing realized, no, this is really not great, and there was a big move for deinstitutionalization. And I want to say something here about parents doing the right thing, because when you're talking to people about guardianship, whether they've been considering it or whether you're dealing with a decision maker who is already under guardianship, you have to remember that people did it for the right reasons, but it's not the right reason anymore. And I always tell this story about my mom's best friend, who we called Aunt Betty. You know how you always call people aunts when they're not really related to you. She had a daughter 2 weeks after I was born. And Susie was born with Down syndrome, and until she was about 11, she was my friend. I would go to her house and play with her. She would come to my house and play with my gang, and it was fine. And then my Aunt Betty was told, you really need to put her in a school with other people like her, because if you don't, she could be abused, she could be preyed upon, she could be sexually exploited, and this is what you need to do to protect her. So off Susie went to Letchworth Village, which was not as bad as Willowbrook, but not very good. And I never saw her again because the folks at Letchworth Village thought that visits would be too disruptive. And Susie died at 19, as people with Downs did at that time. And my Aunt Betty thought she was doing the right thing. So it's always important for me, and I think it's important for you as well, to keep in mind that parents and others are trying to do their best. But what's interesting about this historical view, I think, is that first we didn't need it at all, the protection. Then the protection was deinstitutionalization. And then in the 60s, after the closing of the institutions and these kids who are now in their 30s and 40s and had been in institutions their whole lives being returned to their parents, the parents were freaked out. And so they went as an organized parents group to Albany and said, we need to be able to have the same control over these adult children with IDD that we once had when they were under 18. And so New York's guardianship law, Article 17A of the Surrogates Court Procedure Act, was enacted in the mid-60s as the protection that children of every age with intellectual and developmental disabilities needed, now that institutionalization was not seen as the answer. So Article 17A has two pretty serious consequences. One is that it takes away all of a person's decision-making rights. A person under 17A guardianship can't marry, can't choose where to live, can't choose who to associate with, can't choose whether to work or not to work. A nice guardian may ask them, a nice guardian may go along with them, but as a legal matter, they have absolutely no rights at all. Some of you may have heard about what are called tailored guardianships, or think that maybe there could just be a guardianship about medical decisions. That's true under a different statute, which is called Article 81 of the Mental Hygiene Law. It is not true for these guardianships for people with IDD. And then the second is that once the guardianship is imposed, it lasts forever. Or at least until you go back to court and persuade a judge that it's no longer needed. So it's very serious and it lasts forever. And it's one of the many reasons why we're getting funded to provide an alternative to that. So I want to go back to the timeline, which is the 60s, which is when this statute was enacted, and now think about all the changes that have occurred since that happened. Number one, we just think about people with disabilities, all kinds of disabilities, very differently than we did in the 60s. And probably the biggest example of that is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which you may be aware of. We also now have a wide plethora of services that are available to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to promote self-determination and inclusion. As a matter of law, it's unfortunately honored more in the absence than in the presence, but because guardianship is such a significant deprivation of rights, the Constitution is understood as saying that it can only be imposed if there is no less restrictive alternative. So for us, the rubric of less restrictive alternative is there something that we can do short of guardianship and supported decision-making is what we believe, and many people now believe, is that. But there's also another really important difference, and that is that in our thinking about intellectual and developmental disability, we have moved from what was called a medical model to a social model. So here's the medical model of disability. It sees IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities, as a deficit to be cured. It's a kind of tragedy that happens to someone. It's not their fault, but it's them. It's personal. And because it is a deviation from normal, which is everyone else, it justifies sort of segregation and separate treatment. So that's the medical model. And what we have moved to for other disabilities, and what we are now working at moving towards with regard to developmental disabilities, is a social model. One of the important things about the social model of disability is that it was really the result of work by people with disabilities themselves. It comes out of a disability rights movement. So it's very authentic and very meaningful. It's not just sort of theorists sticking something on top of what's going on. And what it says is that while people might have impairments, so they could be mobility impairments or visual impairments or hearing impairments or intellectual and developmental impairments, what causes the disability, so there's impairments on the one side, which is the characteristic that the person has, but the disability is the way in which society is created as disabling the person from interacting in an inclusive way. So, simple models are people with mobility impairments are disabled from a lot, or were disabled from a lot of activity in society because there were no curb cuts, because there were no elevators, because there were no ramps. And obviously, if everyone was mobility impaired and there were all ramps and so forth, you wouldn't think of a person who couldn't walk as disabled. So that's the kind of impairment versus disability issue. And precisely because it's the disconnect between the impairment and the social setting that is causing the disability, it becomes society's obligation to fix it. So I think that history is helpful because we have 1880s to 1960s, 1960s to now, and now is the next time. And it's the next moment for us to think about what's a better alternative than guardianship for all the reasons that we've just talked about. And so, of course, we think the answer is supported decision-making. So what is supported decision-making? This slide is what I call a fancy definition. It's an academic definition by a friend and colleague of ours who teaches at American University. But I think it's useful because it suggests that there are many, many different ways to do supported decision making. We're going to be talking about one particular way today, but it's important to know that it happens naturally and unnaturally in many other places. So then the question is, assuming that it is this set of arrangements and so forth that enables a person with IDD to make his or her own decisions, where does it come from? And there's really two places. The first is just our human experience of how we all make decisions. We don't make decisions by ourselves, as we say in the law, as tubs in a field. Everybody gets support. Think about big decisions that you've made, or I think about medical decisions or any decisions having to do with cars, about which I know nothing. We get support from our friends, from our neighbors, from our family members. We get support from professionals. Many of you probably don't do your taxes without an accountant, or do your healthcare proxy without a lawyer, or your will without a lawyer, or whatever. So the bottom line here is that everybody uses supports. It's just that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities may need different supports or different kinds of supports. And so here's a kind of list of kinds of support that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities might need. And you'll notice that some of them are also the kinds of supports that you need yourself. You could break this down into 50 or 70 or 1,000 different, but we found it useful. Particularly because I think we'll be talking about this later in the training. This is kind of the hardest thing for people with IDD to conceptualize, is the what kinds of support. So it's helpful also to think about how we use this in our own lives. The gathering of information, the having information explained to us in simple language. We might need that for medical decisions. A person with IDD might need very simple language or repetition. Identifying possibilities and alternatives, helping to weigh choices and consequences. But both what happens if I make this decision, what happens if it goes south, what happens if I don't make this decision. Then particularly for people with IDD who are nonverbal or who use non-traditional means of communication, actually communicating the decisions to third parties, to the banker, to the healthcare professional, et cetera. And finally, helping to implement the decision maker in his or her own decision. And you'll notice that I've been saying decision maker and person with IDD, and I guess this is a good time for me to say, we in this program we don't call people with IDD, or clients or patients or customers. We call them decision makers to make clear from the get-go that they are at the very center of this process. So, as I think the fancy definition indicated, supported decision-making can take many forms. We know that there are tens, hundreds of thousands of people with intellectual disabilities in this state and in this country who are not under guardianship, who are living in the community, who are getting supports from people around them, and who are doing okay. They're not calling it supported decision-making, but it's out there and it's working for a lot of people. You may be familiar with something called circles of support that's used in agency practice. And then there's a more formalized kind of supported decision-making, which can actually end in a written agreement. And that's what we're going to be talking about here, and we'll also be talking about why that's important as an alternative to guardianship. And finally, kind of the most formal, I guess, supported decision-making is that which is legalized by statute. And it's pretty exciting for me because the first conversations about supported decision-making in this country really took place at a roundtable, interdisciplinary roundtable in 2012, which was actually in my courtroom when I was still the surrogate. And I mean, nobody was talking about supported decision-making, and now there are already 4 states that have passed supported decision-making legislation, the District of Columbia. There are a bunch more that are looking at it. Massachusetts just had a statute introduced. So that's the most formalized recognition that we have of supported decision-making. And then the question is, why use supported decision-making? And this goes back, I think, to the historical model and to the sense that there has to be something that's better than guardianship. First of all, of course, people who are using supported decision-making instead of guardianship don't have their rights taken away. They retain all of their rights. It also allows people to make bad decisions. And this is something that you're probably going to have to deal with. It's something that we call neatly the dignity of risk, which is on the one hand about dignity, which I'll be talking about in a minute, but it's also what we all understand, which is that you learn from making bad decisions. You learn from the consequences of your decisions, and I'm sure that's been true in your own lives. And unless we give people the opportunity to make choices and have consequences from those choices, not just you tell your mom, yes, I'd like to do this, and then she does it, and then if something goes wrong, she's on the hook for it, but that you're on the hook for it. That's how you learn. So that's really an important part of why supported decision-making is better. It also helps create a network of supporters who will be there for the decision maker, hopefully throughout his or her life. And it may change, but it's a network, it's not one person. So it's really important in terms of inclusion and in terms of protection. I'll come back to that again. And finally, it's because everyone, every person has a right, a human right, to make his or her own decisions, regardless of his or her disability. So I also want to show you now that from the roundtable discussion in 2012, when nobody knew what supported decision-making was, to today, there's a huge amount of support for it. We're not alone. We're not like a bunch of freaks, at City University of New York or at the Alliance in Albany or in Westchester who have sort of come up with some weird thing that nobody knows about. It's something that's really being recognized throughout the country, from the Administration on Community Living, which is part of Federal Health and Human Services, to the American Bar Association, to the National Guardianship Association, to the Social Security Administration, to the Department of Education. Supported decision-making is in everyone's vocabulary now. It is part of the mainstream, and we are not alone in doing this. So I said that one of the reasons to use supported decision-making is because everyone has the human right to make their own decisions. And unfortunately, people in this country are not very familiar with human rights, so let me give you a very brief explanation, probably more than you came here to hear, but hopefully it will encourage you and inspire you. So what about human rights? First of all, they give us a different and much more affirmative way to look at people with disabilities. The rights that we're familiar with in our Constitution are rights that say the government can't. So the government can't, in theory, interfere with your freedom of speech. It can't interfere with your religion. It can't interfere with your right to carry an AK-47 into a movie theater or a church or a synagogue or whatever. It's mostly all can'ts. Human rights are positive rights as well. They are the rights that we all need to live full and complete and meaningful lives, and that includes the right to adequate nutrition and water and environment and political participation, education, and so forth. So it's a much more affirmative way of looking at the world. They're based in equality and non-discrimination, which we have laws in the U.S. about as well, but they're about no one should be discriminated against because of some characteristic that they have. But they're also based in dignity, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but just stick a pin in it because dignity is really important. And finally, I think this is important, and again, I'll say why in a minute, but locating this work in human rights connects us to an international movement and holds us in solidarity with people with intellectual disabilities and their advocates around the world. And that's something that we found very important for ourselves, for other facilitators that we've trained, and that's really actually important for the decision makers who just love the idea that they're part of an international movement. So let's talk a little bit about where human rights come from. This is a really quick version. After World War II, which was really horrible with the genocide and the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of millions of people who died, the countries of the world all came together and said, we can never let this happen again. They formed the United Nations. I know the United Nations is problematic for some people, but it's still kind of the best hope we have. And within 2 years, the United Nations published a document called the International Declaration of Human Rights. We at Hunter have a particularly warm connection to this because the UN representative to the committee that drew up the Declaration of Human Rights was Eleanor Roosevelt. And we have her house here at Hunter. And I actually only learned last week at an exhibit there that the very first meeting of the committee to draw up the convention was held at a Hunter campus, which is now a different campus in CUNY in the Bronx. But so it all started at Hunter, and so it's only right and good that we should be working with it now. So every nation in the world signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's sort of the understanding of what every government owes to its citizens by virtue of the fact that they are born human. Shortly after the Universal Declaration, it became clear that there were 5 vulnerable groups who might need governments to do more or to do some affirmative actions to make sure that that people could actually exercise these rights. And those groups were racial and ethnic minorities, children, women, people with disabilities, and older persons. And there have now been 4 special conventions. The most recent is people with disabilities. It's called the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which we call the CRPD. And that came into effect in 2008. I'll show you a map in a minute of all the people who have ratified it. But the next thing that you need to know about human rights is that they are, as we say, inalienable, which means they cannot be taken away. You have them. You have them by virtue of being human, and you always have them. They're indivisible, and they're interrelated and interconnected, which means that you can't have one without the others. I mean, you can't really have political participation if you don't have enough food to eat. But in a way, the right of legal capacity, which is what supported decision-making is based in, is the most critical right, because if you can't make your own choices, then you can't live an inclusive life, then you can't participate politically, then you can't have all the rights of a family and intimate relationships. So they're not ranked, but what we're working on is really, really important. Now I want to get back to dignity for a minute. I asked you to stick a pin in it, and here's where I just want you to read this, because this almost always brings tears to my eyes. But it was a fundamental premise of the Declaration of Human Rights, the very beginning of this whole movement. And it reads, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That's how important dignity is. And that's something I think we can really all get behind. Then when we got to the CRPD, again, it's right up there in front. It's in general principles, and the convention says, respect for the inherent dignity, individual autonomy, and the freedom to make one's own choices. So this is really fundamental. Okay, now let's look at the CRPD and Article 12, which is where all of this comes from. So the first paragraph, or the first subsection, says everybody is a legal person under the law. There are places in the world where when a child is born with disability, their birth is not registered. They don't exist in the society. So this is sort of aimed at a somewhat less industrialized or developed society than ours, but nonetheless, it also means that everyone has legal rights. Everyone is a bearer of rights. The second paragraph talks about legal capacity and says that everyone has a right to legal capacity on the same basis, regardless of disability. And this is, I'll give you a definition in a minute, but legal capacity itself is not only the fact that you have rights, but that those rights have to be recognized at law. And your choices have to be recognized at law. And finally, the third section speaks to the state governments, the nation's obligations to provide people with disabilities with the supports that they need in order to exercise the right of legal capacity. So the words supported decision-making aren't anywhere in the CRPD, but this word support right there in Section 3 is, and every convention has a body that is charged with interpreting the convention. In this case, it's called the Committee on the CRPD. And the very first general comment of interpretation that they did was on Article 12 because it's so important. And there they talk both about supported decision-making as one of the supports that people can be given or need to be given in order to make their own decisions. And they also, and I guess this is important going back to the very beginning, say quite clearly and without question that guardianship, which substitutes one person's decisions for another, is a violation of Article 12 and of the human right of legal capacity. So what is legal capacity? It's the right not only to make the decision, I mean, that's all fine and good, but it's also to have that decision legally recognized. So you could make the decision, for example, that you want to open a bank account, or that you want to have a particular medical procedure, or that you want to rent an apartment. But if the doctor or the banker or the landlord says, gee, you know, you look funny, you talk funny, you don't talk at all, I don't really believe that it would be safe for me to deal with you, so you better go get a guardian. Somebody better get a guardian for you, because I'm not going to recognize your right to make this decision. I'm going to want to deal with a guardian. That's the issue about legal capacity. And so the question is, how do we get those third parties to recognize decisions, the legal capacity of people with intellectual disability, again, hearkening back to Article 12, on the same level with all others, regardless of their disability. So that's this description, which comes from the UN itself, and it really talks about the power both to make the decisions and to have them recognized. So that's the UN's definition of legal capacity, but there's another definition that I really like by a guy named Gerard Quinn, who's sort of the guru father of this whole movement, and I've made the slide here. You'll have it to refer to. I really like it. But he talks about legal capacity as what is needed to live in the real world. And so here's the slide, and take a look at it at another time. Now I just want to quickly summarize the human right of legal capacity before we do an exercise. It is the right of all people to make their own decisions, to have their decisions legally recognized, and to have the supports that they need in order to exercise that right. So now we're going to do an exercise, and you've been sitting for a while. So stand up. That's the first part. Find a partner, preferably somebody you don't already know. And now what you're going to do is you're going to talk to your partner, and your partner's going to talk to you about two different things. I want you to think of and report 5 nouns that describe who you are. Nouns, not adjectives, not thoughtful, caring, brilliant, kind, etc., but nouns like teacher, lawyer, lecturer, project director of SDMNY. And then I want you also to think of and report 3 decisions that you made today. So you're going to tell your partner's going to tell you, and then when we sit down and resume, you're going to call out some nouns and you're going to call out some decisions, but they won't be yours, so you don't need to be embarrassed or humiliated, and no one knows who is being called out, so you should feel very free to think of your nouns and your decisions. Okay, you've got about 3 minutes to do this. 5 nouns, 3 decisions. Okay, go. Okay, so if I were really with you, I would have heard some of the nouns you called out. But I will tell you right now that with the exception of sibling or child, that is to say that you are someone's child, every single noun, I would guess, that you called out or that you've used to describe yourself is a result of decisions that you've made in your life. If you're a teacher or a social worker or a lawyer, you decided not only that you would go to college, but you would go and take some additional professional training. If you are a spouse or a partner, you chose someone who hopefully you love and who makes you happy and makes you a better person. I hope some of you called out nouns that have to do with things that you do not for your work but for your spare time. So, you know, if you were a beekeeper, you'd need to learn about bees. If you're a runner, you need to think about what are the best shoes and should I stretch before or after, et cetera. They're all decisions. And so at the end of the day, we are, as people, the sum total of the decisions that we've made in our lives, good and bad. So if you can't make decisions, if you're excluded from making decisions, you're excluded from being a person. That's why it's so important. And now what about the decisions you made today, right? Again, I haven't heard yours, but you know, it's often what time to get up, what to wear, what to eat, et cetera. Just think about what and how you would feel if you weren't allowed to make those decisions. I want oatmeal, no. I want to wear this shirt, nope, sorry, you're wearing this shirt. I want to take the bus, nope, sorry, you're going to take the subway. So you'd feel crummy, you would really feel unrecognized, diminished. You would be without dignity. So that's where we come back to dignity. So that's why this work is so important. We're helping people to be full persons, and we're helping them to keep their dignity. So I promised you a map, going back to the quick one about human rights and why it's so important. This is a map of the world with all of the countries colored in by countries who have ratified the convention, countries who have ratified the convention with what's called the optional protocol. You don't really need to know about this, and countries which haven't ratified the convention. You will notice that the vast majority of countries are red or blue. You see very few yellows. The one up there in the left-hand corner is not a separate country. That's Alaska. That's part of the U.S. And what you'll see is that there are only three countries that have not ratified. The U.S. and the company we keep are Sudan and North Korea. The U.S. just doesn't ratify human rights treaties because we think we know better than anybody else. We don't want anyone telling us what to do. So we have not ratified, although the Obama administration did sign the treaty shortly after Obama was elected, but the Senate has yet to ratify it, and not looking good for this Senate, maybe someday. But now let's get back to why this is sort of significant for us. The question is, how is supported decision-making, which comes from the convention, being ratified being implemented around the world? So there are really two ways. One is that not all countries that ratify conventions take it seriously, but in this case, many have. So there's been a lot of work done on changing guardianship statutes, limiting them, or abolishing them altogether. And, for example, the European Union, which actually ratified this convention as a body, as opposed to just the individual states, it was the first time that ever happened, funded people in every member state to work with the ministries of justice to change the statutes. And so that's going on. It's been going on for a long time, and it's certainly something that we need to look to as we change our law as well. One kind of exciting piece about that is that Israel is a country that has been working on this, and they passed a law about a year and a half ago, sort of adopting supported decision-making, but not with specifics about how it was going to be used. And the Ministry of Justice hired a person to work on that for a year and to come back with recommendations, and just back to putting us in solidarity with people around the world and in an international movement. She came and visited us here and has acknowledged the work that we're doing is very important and something that is being taken into consideration to what they're doing there. So on the law changing, we're involved. The second way in which people are using supported decision-making out of the convention in their national context is with pilot projects. And this really grows out of the understanding that there's a huge amount of stigma and discrimination against people with intellectual disabilities, and a kind of general notion that they can't. They can't make decisions, they can't make good decisions, they can't be trusted, they can't be safe. And so in a number of places, various organizations, non-governmental organizations, social justice organizations, have seen the need to do pilot projects to show that supported decision-making really can work for people for whom judges or legislators or others might not have thought it could work. And that's important to us because they started in 2008. So when we came to this work with our DDPC grant in 2016, and we're really the first major pilot project in the country, we had the experience of a lot of other people. So here's a map of some of those other pilot projects, and we've been able to draw on their work. I've been very fortunate in visiting and working with the folks in Bulgaria, who you would be amazed to know, because you probably don't think highly of Bulgaria, but it's a beautiful, beautiful country, and they've done fabulous work in this area. I've worked with folks in the Czech Republic, in Kenya, and probably the largest number of pilot projects come out of Australia. It's like the US in that it's a federal system, so there are a number of states, and a number of those states have set up their own pilot projects. So there's been a lot of work and a lot of evaluation. And the person who is kind of the mother of supported decision-making in Australia and has created much of the training actually came and worked with us when we were developing our model. So we have the benefit of her work as well. So as you sit here today and in the second day of training, it's not something that we just thought up on our own. It's something that brings to bear the work of many, many people who have actually shown that it can work in their context and who have been generous and thoughtful and helpful to us in creating this model. So now let's get to work here with SDMNY and our facilitation model and what you're going to be learning about today and what hopefully you're going to be doing pretty soon. So our model is to facilitate people with IDD, who, as I've already said, we call the decision maker, to make their own decisions in the areas that they choose with the kinds of support, remember back to the slide about kinds of support, that they want, with trusted people in their lives who they choose as their supporters. And that the work leading up to that and that the choices that they make then get recorded in a written agreement, which we call the SDMA, the Supported Decision-Making Agreement. And we have technically two pilot projects, one which is called diversion and one which is called restoration. I should say at the outset that what you'll be doing as facilitators is virtually exactly the same in both, whether you have a person in the diversion project or the restoration project. There are a few separate issues for restoration, and they're in the manual, they'll be discussed in the training, you can discuss them with your mentor, but otherwise everything is exactly the same. So the diversion project is to divert people who are at risk of guardianship by using supported decision-making. And that's primarily, at least for us so far, it's transition age youth, people between 18 and 21, because that's when the parents are told, you gotta go get guardianship. It could happen later. People could become at risk of guardianship because a medical provider refuses to accept their consent or so forth. But a lot of it is young adults in transition age. And then the second, which is the restoration, is people who are already under guardianship. And the idea is that by creating the process of supported decision-making for them and formalizing it in a written agreement, that it will be possible to go to court where the guardianship was first imposed and persuade the judge that guardianship is no longer necessary because supported decision-making is in place. And that's where DRNY comes in. They will provide the legal services to do this, and a really nice part about it for you to talk about if you need to is that it's all free. And again, I think, particularly in talking about restoration, the thing to remember is that if your DM is under guardianship, it's probably because the person who petitioned for guardianship thought they were doing the right thing. And that's, again, why the historical reference is pretty useful, I think. So I learned this phrase a long time ago, and it's really helpful to me, and I think it's helpful for us in this process, and that is begin with the end in sight. Know where you're going, and then it's the thing that you hold up to yourself throughout the process. And the end of our process is the SDMA. It's the Supported Decision-Making Agreement. And it's about what we call the Big Four, which I will put a slide up for in a minute. But it's more than a document. It's a roadmap to what the decision maker and his or her supporters have agreed upon over, a fairly lengthy process. I'm sure you've been told this, but it could take 6 months, it could take a year. And it's a process that the parties can use throughout the life of the decision maker. So it's not just a piece of paper, it's a process, and it's a process that you help bring about. And the facilitation process itself, what you're going to be doing in the 3 phases that we've divided this process into, should also model, in a way, what supported decision-making is going to look like going forward. And so that is very much about having the decision-maker at the center of the process. This is his or her process. He is completely at the center. It's under his or her control, just as going forward it should be. So that's an important thing to remember as well. So I said it's about the Big Four. So here they are, and this is the thing you really have to memorize. Here are the Big Four. The first, and we did it, of course, to make it, zippy, which, who, what, how. The which is the areas in which the decision maker may want or choose to have support. There could be 1, there could be 10. The common ones are healthcare, education, housing, finances, intimate personal relations, getting supports, organizing, benefits, and so forth, and then a whole host of others. And I should say now, as we'll say throughout, that the SDMA is absolutely personalized to the DM that you're working with. And in the last year and a half of doing this work, many of our DMs have come up with areas that we never thought of, including helping me with my self-advocacy and to spread the message, which is really great, and many others. So this is just sort of a suggestion, but it's the which. So the first thing you're going to work on is the which. Then the who. The who is the trusted persons in the DM's life. And I say DM sometimes because it's shorter than decision maker. In the DM's life, who he or she selects to provide support. There could be one supporter. We don't think that's so great, and so far we haven't done that. The largest number I think we've had is 11. That creates a logistical nightmare, but if it's what the DM wants, that's what the DM gets. And sometimes, as I think you'll hear in the training, it's hard for the DM to decide who they want as supporters, and many of them, especially the transition age young adults, really have always sort of looked to their families. So sometimes it's a little journey of discovery to think about other people in your life who might be able to support you. And again, you'll hear this over and over again, but supporters can change. So the supporters of today are not written in stone. There can be new supporters throughout a person's life. Then there's the what. So we've done the which and the who. The what is what kinds of support. Go back to that slide on gathering information, explaining information, helping to think about alternatives, communicating, and implementing. And then finally, how. The how is logistics. And when we started this, we had no idea this was going to be the most complicated, but it really is, particularly in New York City, but we're finding this is true around the state. People's lives are incredibly busy, and so getting people together for these meetings alone is difficult, and then thinking about how supporters are going to work with a decision maker when, like in one of our cases, the DM chose somebody who lives in Toronto, somebody who lives in California, a sibling who lives in New Jersey, and then people who live all over New York City. So the how could be, are we all going to meet together, and are you going to give me the support? Are we going to do this by Skype? Are we going to do it by email? It's just, it's a whole range of things. And because this is something that's so fluid, it's not actually in the SDMA, because you can imagine you'd have to change that agreement like every other week when somebody couldn't do the Skype or their computer broke down or whatever. So you're going to be working through this, but in terms of the SDMA itself, it's the which, the who, and the what that ultimately go into that agreement. There is a core principle. All these other things can change. They're all personalized. They're all something that the DM can decide on. This is something the DM can't decide on. And that is that the DM remains in control of this agreement forever. He can revoke it, he or she can change it. There could be new areas where a person wants support that just weren't in their lives before. Like, should I have a baby? What does it mean? Or there could be areas where the person has just developed a sufficient amount of personal capability that they don't need supporters anymore. So it can be changed, and supporters can be changed, or supporters can leave. One of the sort of good things about this flexibility, and I think especially when you're talking to parents of transition age youth, is that it's very hard for people to think about getting old and becoming incapacitated themselves or dying. But parents do have to think about that. And so the idea that the supporters can change, that they can be intergenerational, that there can be younger people who are there to provide the support when the parents are no longer able to do it or no longer around, is really a big plus here. And I think something that you may want to emphasize as you work through it. So beginning with the end in sight, the end is the SDMA, and let's just review the purposes of it. One is that it's your goal. So when it's signed, you know that you've done your job. Everybody has done their job, and you can all celebrate. And it's the success of our facilitation process. It formalizes the agreement, right? And it provides a reference if misunderstandings occur. So if mom was only supposed to gather information but not to discuss and support in weighing alternatives, because the DM says, once my mom says, I think this is a better alternative, I know I'm going to do it because I don't want to make her mad. If mom forgets or if the DM forgets, it's in writing. And people can be reminded of what they are supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. And as I said, it allows for a lot of flexibility as things change over time, because this is a process that the DM is going to be using throughout his or her life. All these things can change, and that makes it a process that's good for a long time. It also, this is the agreement itself, demonstrates that there is a process in place through which the person with an intellectual or developmental disability has determined how he or she will get support, and that there's been a facilitation process, that it's not just signing a piece of paper, but that people have really worked through it, that the process has integrity, and that it's something that a court can rely on as a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. So it's partly for the courts. And finally, it's evidence and provides a model should New York decide to pass legislation, as if you'll remember back to the chart I showed you about who supports supported decision-making, the 4 states already, Texas, Delaware, Wisconsin, and Alaska, the District of Columbia. When we are ready to go to the legislature in New York, which should be sort of towards the end of our 5-year project, we're going to have a lot of people who have signed a lot of supported decision-making agreements, and we can show that to the legislature, and we can have the decision makers come and talk to them and explain what happened, and maybe even you as a facilitator. So that's an important part of the supported decision-making agreement as well. So now you have the end in sight. How do you do it? Let's talk a little bit about facilitation, what it is and what it isn't. What SDM facilitation is assisting the parties in creating the process by which the decision maker will utilize his or her supporters to make decisions in particular areas, and how that's going to be done and so forth, hopefully for many years. And it is, of course, describing and formalizing that agreement in an SDMA. It's equally important to think about what SDMNY facilitation is not. It is not person-centered planning. Those of you who work in this area are probably, or or in education or whatever are familiar with person-centered planning, we share many of the same goals, but it's different because person-centered planning is about goals. Supported decision-making is about decisions. This is going to come up a lot in your training today. It's very easy for us to get into what would you like to do, as opposed to think about the decisions that you're going to have to be making. That doesn't happen a lot in person-centered planning, and person-centered planning also is really a lot about the services that somebody's going to get from providers, and it takes place in the provider's office or in the office of the school. This is for your life going forward, for all the kinds of decisions that a decision maker may want to make. It is not problem solving. It's just so easy. I mean, I'm like a problem solver, so like, I suppose it's partly vanity too, like I can solve that problem. And it's so easy to sort of jump in and say, oh, so here's how you do it. Oh, you want it, so what you want is an apartment? Okay, let's figure out how to get you your apartment. That's not supported decision-making facilitation. The issue is much more, if you want an apartment, what kinds of decisions are you going to have to make? Like the neighborhood, how much money you have to spend, do you want a roommate, don't you want a roommate? But it's not about getting the apartment, it's about the decisions that have to be made and what kind of support you might need in doing that. And it is not any of the skills that you have spent a lot of time and money in your life developing, like counseling or therapy or mediation or anything else. It's really different. It's so interesting. When I was trying to find a synonym for facilitation, it just kept being you're facilitating someone. So it's not any of those things. And if you are a social worker, if you are a mediator, many of the skills that you have developed to do that work are useful here, but it's not any of those things. So as our colleague Gina Riley always says, you have to take off your hat, your social worker hat, your mediator hat, your mom hat, whatever it is, and put on the facilitator hat. So let's talk about facilitation and the cast of characters. At the center, as you have already heard many times, is the decision maker. Then there is the facilitator, that would be you. And the sort of great thing for you in this training is that when we started out, we just kind of thought we knew what we were doing, but now that we've been doing it for 2 years, we've learned a lot, and we've learned a lot from many people who have taken this training before, so the training is better, and who have been facilitating, so we know a lot more about what could go wrong and what goes right and so forth. So there's the facilitator. Then there's the mentor, and we haven't talked about that before, but and it's something that's turned out to be much more important in this process than we thought when we started. The mentor is a person who's done facilitation and is knowledgeable about it and is there for you as a coach and a backup. You will not be alone in this process. You will not only have a plethora of materials, many of which you're getting today, but you will have a mentor who you will check in with before and after your facilitation sessions, somebody there to solve problems with. And we're also running now a community of practice phone calls for facilitators and mentors so that as issues come up, people can share the kinds of solutions they've had. So the mentor is really quite important. And then there's the supporters. And the supporters obviously are people who are chosen by the decision making. A lot of people have asked, where do the decision makers come from? So we've recruited in a lot of different places. We've done many information sessions at schools because of the transition age youth and parents. And I might say, so that you see that we walk the walk, that whenever we do information sessions, while we may do them for parents, we do them for the students as well. And the parent may say, you know, I want my son or daughter to be in this program, and we say to them, no, it's actually for your son or daughter to decide whether they want to be in the program. So we've worked with schools, we've worked with self-advocacy groups, a lot of work with self-advocacy groups, and then in just a whole variety of places with providers, in other educational settings and so forth. So your DM may come from many different places. But also your DM has been signed up in advance. We know something about them, and our site coordinators do a really nice job, I think, of matching the DMs with facilitators, both in terms of like your location and the times that you're available and so forth, and sometimes even sort of interests and other connecting things. So that's the cast of characters. We have divided the facilitation process into 3 phases. So I'm going to go through them now so that you know what's coming, and the training after we spend the first day doing a lot more about the SDMA and about skills that you need to know and practice and learn, and about some technology that you're going to have to master in order to do your check-ins and so forth. Day 2 of the training really goes through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And I'll also, as I talk about each phase, I'll also have a slide on the materials that will be available. I'm not going to discuss those, but just so you know that you've got a lot of written support, as well as your mentor and as well as the training that you're getting here. So phase 1 is the facilitator working with the DM, getting to know the DM, who they are, what they're about, creating what our colleague Gina Riley calls a right relationship, a relationship that's like that, not like that, not, I don't know if she has some phrase for it, but anyway, you get it, a relationship of equality. And then using 2 of these tools, the SDMNY worksheet, which is where you'll start fleshing out the ideas of the which, the what, the who, and the how. And then slowly over the course of the first phase, and then again using it in the 3rd phase, the Big 4 chart, which will ultimately turn into your SDMA. So you'll be acquainting the DM with these instruments, you'll be filling things in, you'll be moving them from the worksheet to the chart. And this is really important. This is not just sort of about getting information and getting to the SDMA because it's the end and it's a written document. It's also about the process of empowering the DM to start thinking of him or herself as a decision maker. And I think we've found a lot, and particularly in working with transition age young adults, that they don't think of themselves as decision makers. I mean, they've always been taught to do what people tell them to do. And so sometimes it's a little difficult, but it's really a course of exploration and empowerment that has in some ways been the most exciting thing for us in the 2 years that we've been doing this now, to just see people change and to become agents in their own lives. So that's what you're starting to do in phase 1 and throughout. And it's also priming the DM for phases 2 and 3. So phase 2, which we'll get to in a second, is working with the supporters. And so it means not only saying these are the people that I want to be my supporters, but getting them ready for things that may or may not be so great, like a supporter who says, well, I don't really know if the person can do it, or I don't want to do this, even though that very seldom happens, and how to approach the supporter and how to give the supporter information and so forth. And then also, getting them the self-confidence and the skills and the sense of self necessary in phase 3 to really manage the process of writing the agreement, because again, it's their process. So you have your slide with the tools. Now phase 2 is working with the supporters. And there are really 2 main tasks here. One is to educate the supporters. So with transition age young adults, they're probably parents, and they may have come to an information session, and so they heard me or Hezi or Joan or somebody else who will be with you today talk about supported decision making. But it's a lot, as you know, and so they're probably going to need some more conversation about it. And then there'll be supporters who didn't come to an information session, and it's the basketball coach or the sibling or the friend or whatever. So all of that has to be explained. People have to be educated about it. And then what we call repositioning. And this is the getting people to move from the relationship that they have now with the DM, which is, I know what's best, here's what's in your best interests, let me help you, let me do it for you, let me pave the way, to you are an autonomous human being and I'm going to support you in making your decisions, good and bad, hopefully mostly good, but understanding that they may be bad. And I always say this is something that parents of neurotypical kids go through, often kicking and screaming, but it is like a real change in your relationship, and so that's what we have to help the supporters do with regard to the DM. And only when you are finished with phase 2, only when you are really persuaded that the supporters have bought in and are prepared to take on that role, then you move to phase 3. So here are the tools that you have. Phase 3, I'm a lawyer, so I think of this as where everybody sits around a table and negotiates the contract. That's what the SDMA is, even though it's not legally binding. They sit around and negotiate the contract, and new information may come in, a new which might come in. I mean, the DM might have said, I want support in housing and money, and then mom comes in to phase 3 and is at the table and says, but whenever you go to the doctor, you always say, like, I don't want to deal with this, you deal with this for me. Maybe you want some support in healthcare decisions too. So that could change. The what could change, the how could change. And it goes on, as a negotiation does, until people basically are in agreement with everything that's on the Big Four chart. And the Big Four chart gets changed over and over again through this process. And eventually everybody agrees on the which, who, what, how. And then you, as the facilitator, will begin to do a first draft of an agreement. We have a template. Hezi's going to take a lot of time talking to you about the SDMA and the template and so forth, so I'm not going to say more about that now. But you'll have a first draft. You'll go back to your mentor. It'll get drawn up. It'll come back to the table. People will look at it and say, no, that's not what I meant at all. I want this, I want that. And then finally, everybody agrees. There's a final draft, the final meeting, and the signing of the agreement, both by the DM and by the supporters who agree that they will be supporters and not substitute decision makers, that they will not engage in conflicts of interest, that they will not exert undue influence. And although at this moment there's no legal, this is not a legally binding agreement, we have found, and we've learned from other pilots, that it's really great to have it notarized. I mean, it just gives it more gravitas. People take it more seriously, always have the big seal on it. And what we've been doing here, and maybe you'll want to do it as well, is we really kind of make it a ceremony, a celebration of people doing a lot of hard work and coming to a place that's really a beautiful place about the empowerment of the DM and an agreement among everybody at the table. So phase 3 ends with the agreement being signed, as I've said, hopefully a nice celebratory event. And as a facilitator, your role ends, although we would really love it if you would stay in contact. SDMNY, whether it's through you or through the site coordinator or your mentor, will be checking in with the parties over the next year or so just to see how it's going. We're also developing a mediation process for when there might be disagreements. We anticipate actually that's more likely to be between supporters than between supporter and DM, so we'll have a lot of tools available. But your role technically ends with the signing. And as you've heard over and over again, the agreement then becomes the roadmap for the DM to make decisions in the rest of his or her life. Both the DM and particularly the supporters and the parents, if there are parents, and the former guardian, if there's a former guardian, are always interested in knowing what the legal effect is of the SDMA. And unfortunately, at this moment in New York, there is no legal effect whatsoever. It's not binding on third parties, but third parties can accept it. And again, in the segment today about the way we devise the template, there's information about the process that people went through to get to the agreement and so forth. And the agreement itself says, the DM says, I would like third parties to accept this agreement and decisions that I make under it. So, it is possible, hopefully it is likely that people will accept it, but in order for them to be required to accept it, we need legislation. And that's something that we're going to start thinking about in the 4th year of the project. And you'll be part of that. So we are trying to work on agreements with other parts of government, OPWDD, departments of education, that they will accept the SDMA in terms of allowing the supporter in or whatever the DM has requested. And we have some nice models there in education. DC has had regulations in their Department of Education for several years. There's a county in Nevada that's doing it now. So hopefully not too long from now, you'll be able to say, yes, 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 DOE will accept, and so forth. So remember we started off with why do people seek guardianship? And one of the reasons was because they want to protect their loved one with an intellectual or developmental disability. So now we're sort of at the end of the road, and the question is, well, does the SDMA, does this process protect the person or not? And I think that the answer to that is twofold. One is that it does create this circle of support. If there are several supporters or a number of supporters, even if one of them kind of gets out of line or tries to exercise undue influence or push somebody towards decisions, there are other people watching. And to the extent that supported decision-making allows a person to live more inclusively in the community, there are more people watching. So the more people that are watching, the less likely it is that there's going to be abuse or exploitation. But it also fosters self-determination, which makes it much easier for people to protect themselves. And I said this for a long time, but now I have some wonderful backup. The National Council on Disabilities, which is a federal agency with members appointed by the president and Congress and so forth, came out with a big report last year on alternatives to guardianship that would increase self-determination. A big section on supported decision-making, as we would have hoped and as you might expect. And so this quote that supported decision-making fosters self-determination, enables the decision-maker to become more independent, more integrated in the community, better problem solvers, better employed, healthier, and better able to identify and resist abuse. And then one more, this is my favorite quote of all, people with intellectual disabilities learn through the process of making decisions. It's not about protecting someone, it's about teaching them how to protect themselves. So the question is, does it work? And again, this is why it's really nice to be doing this 2 years into our testing of the model, because we now have a bunch of decision makers who have signed SDMAs, a bunch of parents and others who have been involved in the process and who are supporters. And here's just one of them. Here's a mom, Beth, and let's hear what she says about it.
My name is Beth. I'm a supporter and parent of a young man who's a ever-growing identity as a decision maker. And we've been lucky enough to be part of this supported decision-making New York project. Our son, who's now 20, has an intellectual and developmental disability, and we were lucky enough to be diverted towards supported decision-making right when we were at the cusp of actually pursuing guardianship. So it was really fortunate. The project team came to our son Thomas's program, and the minute we heard about it and began to have conversation with this great group, it felt like a big relief. We were able to take a deep breath because of the opportunities in this new model just seemed to resonate with us. We felt like he spent so much time trying to find his voice, and to not have an ongoing system that supported that, but rather took away his voice, was something that we just kept drudging through, because we were encouraged that was a safe thing we needed to do to protect our son. And to have now this other framework that actually supports all the work that he's been doing to be more of a decision maker, to honor that, and to have that so well facilitated, just we're so grateful and happy about it. I think the big things that we've noticed and are really excited about is to watch our son grow in the process, and for also all of us who are in his family and his supporters and our friends to actually re-examine how we are with him and how we have changed our perspective to find different ways of supporting his identity as a decision maker, that he does have strengths in all of these different areas and ability to identify his preferences for people who are going to support him, that really only took place by this very high quality facilitation. So I don't think this is a I'm trying to think, I want to say from a policy perspective, this needs to be really well supported to make sure that it can be really successful, given that there's some quality facilitation built in. It's been an ongoing process. It did take time for my son to start identifying himself as a decision maker and understanding the pride and further development he has once that began. Was really exciting. And it really, I think, expanded our perspective for him, rather than starting to feel like, as things were ending, that his world was constricting. And this has really changed our perspective, and I think has given him a platform to become just more and more of himself, and have the opportunity to have that be supported. So thank you. We're really happy to be involved.
So I almost always cry when I see that, because I remember Beth and I remember her son, and he was one of those decision makers who came in saying, decisions, whatever. And he's just a wonderful, wonderful young man, and we're thrilled that the process has been so successful for them as it has been for many others. And I just want to highlight what Beth says about that the process really has to be well done. This is really important to us. This is not about having people sign a piece of paper, which unfortunately is what is the case in some of the states that have adopted this legislation. This is about giving people a meaningful process with integrity. And I think that her testimonial really highlights that, and it's really important to us, and it should be important to you in the work that you're going to do. So all three phases of the facilitation build towards the SDMA. It's the end. It incorporates the agreement. All the hard work that you did is in this agreement. It's now down on paper. All of the tools that you've used that are in your workbox, toolbox, the worksheet, the Big Four chart, the cheat sheets, the protocols, and so forth, all moving towards this end. But there's another end to this process, and I think that it's important to note it, and it's really something that we've learned in the process of doing this work over 2 years, and that's transformation. So what we have seen, and what is so heartening, so dare I say thrilling, is the transformation of the DM. It's just happened in every case. They are just different people at the end. And I remember one of the facilitators describing the first meeting in phase 3, where everybody sits down at the table to start negotiating. And her DM, who had been very reluctant, very kind of not chatty, not whatever in the beginning, really kind of had to be pushed, walks into the room, sits at the head of the table, and says to everyone, "This is my meeting to discuss my supported decision-making agreement." Just a breathtaking moment. So there's that transformation. Then there's the transformation of the supporters, especially the parents who wanted to protect their kid, because that's what everybody wants to do, and told that they could do it only in one way, and now see, as Beth says, that it's allowing their young adult to be the person that he should be and wants to be. But there's one other transformation as well, and one that, I don't know, we didn't think about as much when we developed the model, but which has really been quite stunning, and that is the transformation of the facilitator. I don't think that there's anyone who's done this work who hasn't both learned and changed as a result of it. Here's a little quote, and I hope that will be your experience as well. So, having hopefully inspired you and excited you, now there's a test. What are the Big Four? Okay, which, who, what, and how. And what you'll be doing today is talking much more about the template that we have developed, how we developed it, why we developed it, how you'll work with the parties and the Big Four chart to get to it, and some stuff about skills, and then some tech stuff. And then in day 2, you'll be going through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 with a lot of interactive work that hopefully will enable you to feel much more confident about what you're doing it. But finally, I want to thank you for your attention. I know listening to talking heads, especially talking heads on the screen as opposed to in person, is really hard. So I appreciate your attention, and I wish you good luck, and I thank you so much for joining us on this amazing journey.